I'm Julie Kohler, host of the White Picket Fence podcast. If you've read the opinion section of any newspaper lately, you've probably come across think pieces panicking about falling marriage rates. They make sweeping claims that getting married will make you happier, healthier, and wealthier. Some even say that getting married is a way to stick it to the elites. I'm not so sure about that. This season on White Picket Fence, we're examining the current marriage panic. We'll go beyond the rosy sheen of love and commitment and expose the darker side to all of this marriage talk and explore what becomes possible when we broaden our imagination around what relationships can look like. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back, Brown Girls. Ashanti here, the founder of the Brown Girls Guide to Politics, and this is the final episode of Season 2. While we recorded this episode a few weeks ago, it is airing on the day of the Iowa Presidential Caucus, which officially starts the 2020 election season. I wanted to make the last episode of this season about highlighting women of color who are leading on some of the top issues that will dominate the political season, such as healthcare, civil rights and voting rights, and the environment. I was pleased to be joined by Emily Crerand, National Campaigns Director for the League of Conservation Voters, Tiffany Loftin, Director of the NAACP Youth Division and a contributor to the Brown Girls Guide to Politics blog, and Anisha Singh, Director of Judiciary and Democracy Affairs at Planned Parenthood Action Fund. We had a live discussion on what we can expect as women of color in 2020 that was hosted at George Washington University and sponsored by Act Blue. I hope you enjoy this episode. So I always like to start with everyone introduce themselves, but of course I also have to ask everyone a question along with that. So can you tell everyone your name, where you work, what you do, and what has been one of your favorite moments from this election cycle so far? I know there's so many to choose from because even though it's only January, this thing has been long. But what's one of the things that has been in the forefront of your mind?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me on the show. My name is Anisha Singh. I'm the Director of Judiciary and Democracy Affairs at Planned Parenthood Action Fund. My main role is to make sure that we are linking and connecting the dots on why reproductive health care is so important and why the courts and democracy reform are so crucial for protecting our rights when it comes to reproductive health care. One of the things, I mean, there's so many things that have been, I feel like, monumental in this cycle, but one of them is the fact that there are and have been so many women who are running for presidency, and what that really means for communities of color, what that means for communities across the board, what that means for young people who are looking and seeing people represented on the screen when watching these debates, when watching the campaign trail and seeing that reflection, and then what that has meant for the conversation as well, right? We've seen all the Democratic candidates come out in favor and support of reproductive rights and in repealing the Hyde Amendment, all of which I truly believe we can pay tribute to the fact that there are so many diverse voices that are pushing each other to be bolder and vocally bolder in their policies.
Hey, Tiffany Loftin. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California. I live here in the DMV area. I'm the National Director for the Youth and College Division at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which I will from now on refer to as the NAACP. And I have two. So one of them happened last night when Elizabeth Warren said, or she made the awareness known that all the women have not lost an election, but all the men collectively have lost over 2 elections. I thought that was pretty badass.
That was like iconic. She's had a lot of iconic moments, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I love the very visible presence and leadership of Black women in the campaigns. Mm-hmm. I love the chief of staff from Julian Castro's camp. I love watching Black women for Warren. I love watching Black women for Bernie. This notion, right, that there needs to be a special emphasis that is very public and unapologetically public for Black women. So those are my two favorite moments in this campaign so far.
Yes.
I do not like how many debates we're having, but that's a different conversation.
And how late they are.
And how, like, yes.
They are late. Emily.
I'm Emily Crerand. I am one of the national campaigns directors at the League of Conservation Voters, LCV. We elect environmental champions at all levels of government and then hold them accountable. In 2018, we were one of the top outside spenders in electoral politics, spending over $80 million to help get environmental champions elected up and down the ballot. I actually have two favorite moments. I would say the first is the fact that there is an Asian American presidential candidate that's on the stage. Yes, he's a man, but it's Asian American. That's huge for us, for the AAPI community. I would say the second one is similar in terms of the diversity of staff on these campaigns and how hyped and highlighted they are. It's very tough to be a minority as a politico and to have that standard and to have that bar and to feel like minorities have an opportunity to work in this business is huge. And it's really changing the face of how campaigns are being put together and who's pulling the levers.
All right, our next question, talking about women of color voters. We know that we'll be crucial to this election cycle. You can't win without us. That's just how it is. And we are one out of every 4 voters in Florida, Texas, Arizona, and Georgia. How have you already seen women of color shape this election cycle, particularly in the work that you do?
I think this is like such a crucial moment, and we've really seen this wave of engagement and energy and progress being made when you look at the reproductive justice movement. And special shout out to groups like All Above All and others that have really paved the way for reproductive health care and reproductive freedom, reproductive justice issues and legislative policies. I mean, they are responsible for the fact that we're seeing all of these Democratic candidates saying that they want to repeal the Hyde Amendment. The push of the conversation and the narrative in that direction has been particularly helpful because of the leadership coming from reproductive justice organizations.
And I would say, and just to piggyback on that, much like Planned Parenthood, we have state affiliates as well, and we were huge in the Virginia sweep in November. And our Virginia affiliate endorsed 62 candidates that were pro-climate. 30 of them were women, more than a dozen were women of color. So you have folks like Delegate Hashmi, and also folks like Virginia Romero down in Tucson who won their races, who ran on climate, who ran on environmental issues, who won, and to really advance, issues like climate change in everyday, I guess highlight it at a level that necessarily may not be through the lens of being of a minority female, and especially in communities where they are not less equal, but where they're disadvantaged and they don't have someone that can speak up and help them fight every day.
There's been a wave, I'm thinking about what both of you all said. There's been a wave of, I work with young people. Anybody 25 and younger, that's my audience. I work with young Black people across the nation. We have over 339 chapters across the country. I gained 32 chapters last year alone. We work with 23,000 young Black people across the country. And when we saw Stacey Abrams running last year, and we went to polling places at Spelman and at Morehouse in Atlanta, in Georgia, we got there, our students got there and stood in line and realized that there were no outlets or there were no plugs or there were no wires for the voting machines. And it was young Black women at those schools at Spelman who said to the NAACP, we need to file a lawsuit because this is not how democracy should be working.
I love that. And I think that's a great segue. It wasn't one of the pre-planned questions, but I love when I love when the conversation goes in this direction because we do talk very high level all the time about how these women, these people of color are driving the conversations, but each of you work with organizations where there are women of color who are doing the work every day on the ground, that the unsung heroes. So I know, Tiffany, you just mentioned Amari, but who are some of the women that you think we should know that you work with who are making it possible? Because we are talking about 2020, but even in conversations I have at work and every day, I'm like, we cannot neglect the state and local because at the end of the day, that's where the laws are passed, the policies happen that impact our daily lives. And it is like young people, women of color who are driving that. So who are some of the great women at the League of Conservation Voters, at Planned Parenthood, who are making this happen?
LCV has taken a huge step forward in ensuring that progressive organizations look and reflect what America looks like. And I would say that it is because of the young women of color who are in some of those more junior level positions that do get overlooked. They are actually spearheading the organization and the unionization effort of LCV to ensure that there is, paid family leave, that there is some transparency into the decision making, which is, typically, is white hierarchy, but that they have a voice at the table. I think that's huge. I think it's also we have a CHISPA program, which is our Latino program that is on the ground in several states, which is huge, that are the unsung heroes for our climate program. And I also think that in addition to just the paid stuff with LCV, it's also sort of opens up the larger can of worms, which is the vendor policy.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that because it's very similar. At Planned Parenthood Action Fund, you look at a lot of the junior staff individuals who are working on cross-movement work, and I feel like they are doing the best work because it's really important when you're an issue-based organization that you are being really thoughtful about how your issue intersects with other organizations, with other issues. When we're talking about reproductive health care, we're also talking about economic justice. We're also talking about racial justice. We're talking about immigration, we're talking about democracy reform, etc. And it's the individuals, I feel like, who are at Planned Parenthood, who are majority women of color, who are leading that work at our organization. And you see that reflected in the way that our talking points and the way that our report, that's because of them, right? Doing the work, doing that cross-coalition networking and conversations, those tough conversations with partners and folks on the ground, and then of course our health centers and our patients and our doctors and our health center leaders who are also leading the charge and making sure that every day the day-to-day fights that are happening in states, in the localities, in their legislators are remembered and are fought, and that they are constantly keeping up that drumbeat while in coalition and being good partners with the groups on the ground as well across the cross-movement issues I mentioned. And so that to me is just phenomenal work. Prior to working at Planned Parenthood, I worked at the Center for American Progress and was doing Why Courts Matter work across the country. And I do want to I'm thinking about this one woman, Khadija Kenner, who she's the first person to really get arrested here on the Capitol fighting over a lower court nominee. And that's just something you don't see in the progressive movement. You don't see us galvanize around the judiciary the way conservatives do. And I can talk about that for like 10 hours.
Okay.
But this woman brought 9 people with her, and their goal was to come up from Pennsylvania and make sure that they did a sit-in. And if it meant getting arrested, it meant getting arrested because this nominee was so bad. These are lifetime appointments. And she did the work. And she led that charge. And it inspired the entire court's coalition movement to the point where years later we're here, and now I'm at Planned Parenthood and I'm still hearing about that story. And so, and that's kind of galvanizing and energizing us, and it helped pave the way that we did a lot of the work that we did in the Kavanaugh fight too. So all that to say, they're just really great folks on the ground every day who do this because they're passionate, they care about the work, they're not doing it for the money, they're not doing it for the fame, but they're doing it because they recognize what's at stake in our democracy.
Okay, I'm going to say some names real quick because I want them to hear themselves on a podcast.
Okay.
They don't get to hear their names on a podcast. So I already mentioned Amari Fenoy. I want to say DeAngelique Jackson. She is a young black woman who is at University of California, Fresno. And California State, Fresno. She is one of the co-authors and leaders behind a state legislative bill that passed, making sure that the state of California invested resources in each one of the public state schools in California for this year's election to make sure that there was an actual box on the campus where students could go and drop off their ballots. And each school has to have a civic engagement youth and adult coordinator. And now we're using it as a model to replicate in other states. Mm-hmm. So DeAngelique Jackson. Taylor Turnage is a young woman who's in Mississippi. She was actually newly elected NAACP State Conference president for our youth. She's turning out folks at Tougaloo College. Then there's Brisa Johnson, who's not an NAACPer, because I have love for people who are not NAACP. She is the California Statewide Civic Engagement Director for United Domestic Workers. The girl is bad. And she's in San Diego, and she's organizing statewide. She was one of our trainers. I invited her to our convention to train our youth on civic engagement campus organizing. She's bad. I can't forget Ensei Ufat, who is the Ensei is amazing. She's in Georgia. I think she's the ED, executive director of the new Georgia Project. When people were getting their stuff purged because their names were wrong and because the hyphen or the exclamation point wasn't where it was supposed to be, that was the sister who was looking at making sure like that they held accountable. What's his name? Who ran for governor and won against Stacey Abrams?
State Governor Kemp.
Yeah, the Secretary of State. And she was the only one holding him accountable and putting his feet to the fire. And I was like, yo, she's bad. And she's a young black woman who often gets ignored. And the last one, last but not least, is you. And the work that you do, Ashanti, because I feel like you have this platform and you train these folks across the country. This is not the first time you and I have worked together, but I don't think that your name is always the one that's thrown in the hat to get recognized. So I want to make sure that when we talk about the unsung heroes, which like that's kind of like a shadowy name, you are one of those people as well. And I also saw your tweet to Cardi B when she said she thinks she want to run for office, and you're like, I will train you and support you. That's an important element of our civic engagement work. Yeah. It's not just the ballot. It's not just the polling place. It's not just the trainings. It's also who are training other dope women of color to run for office. And in my book, you really don't know one who does that. So
Thank you. But I don't know if everyone saw it, but Cardi B tweeted that she wanted to be a politician. And it's like, it showed up in my feed. And literally, I was like,
first one. She was like, I'll train you.
I was like, if you want training to run for office, let me know.
I got you.
But then the next day, she did another tweet, and it was what I see all the time with women when they want to run for office or enter politics. If I just go back to school and get more education, then I feel that I can really shake the table. And I was like, even you, Cardi B? Wow. Like, even you have that imposter syndrome, because just women, when it comes to running for office, politics, we always feel that everything has to be perfect.
We're not qualified enough yet.
Right. And it's like, I had to retweet Cardi B and be like, I see this all the time, women thinking that they need a ton of higher education in order to make a difference. But the fact is, and I just heard it with all the young women that you talked about, if you have the drive, if you have the ideas, if you have the determination, you're already ready to shake the table. Small dollar donors are transformative. I've seen it firsthand working on campaigns, big and small, across the country. ActBlue is a nonprofit organization dedicated specifically to empowering small dollar donors. As one ActBlue donor named April acutely shared, my motivation in giving was to be a small force for good in this country. Many times, we feel like our voices aren't heard. Unfortunately, money is heard more than our voices these days. I believe that even small donations will help us reach the goal of getting a president in office that cares about respect and equal rights for all people, no matter what. April knows the power of ActBlue's fundraising platform, which makes it easy for grassroots supporters to make their voices heard and helps thousands of Democratic campaigns, progressive organizations, and nonprofits build people-powered movements. This election cycle, small dollar donors are on track to give $3 billion via ActBlue, with an average contribution size of about $30. Visit secure.actblue.com/about to make your voice heard. So earlier, before we started the panel, we were talking about polls. I have a lot of things to say about polls, but women of color voters in particular delivered us the most diverse Congress that we have in history. We have the first 2 Indigenous women in Congress, the first 2 Latinas from Texas, and we have the squad. And when we think about it, polls showed the majority of those women not even coming out of their primary, let alone winning the election. And we have definitely seen them shape the conversation. We have all of these new voices. So for you, in your opinion, what is this telling us about how women of color elected officials, women of color in this space, even though we may not be mainstream, we're still able to drive the national conversation? like thinking about Stacey Abrams, I tell people, like, I love Stacey, I'm a Stacey fan. The fact is, for me, when she did not win her election, I call him fake Governor Kemp, because in my mind, Stacey is a real governor. Most people would have just been like, okay, I'm done. But she did not. I think she is the epitome of servant leadership, in that she said, this is what I'm going to do to not only make Georgia better, but make the country better, so that this doesn't happen to other people. So really, what are we seeing now in 2020 with how women who aren't even in elected office are shaping this conversation? Like, how do you see that in the work that you're doing?
So one of my favorite quotes, and I take this everywhere with me, and I'm sure many of you have heard it, is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? And I think there's this realization that's happening, and that happened in 2018 too, where there were women who looked at what happened in 2016 election and said, we got to take things in our own hands, right? We got to run for office ourselves, and we have to be at the table so that our communities are not on the menu. And so that's what we saw with the wave of young women of color that came into our House of Representatives, but also across the board in state legislators, we saw that kind of a movement as well. And we're seeing that now too. We're seeing that it's not just the elected officials and those running for office, but those that are getting involved in marches and knocking on doors and with campaigns. It's a whole new face. It's a lot of young people. Young people are more engaged now than ever before. And they want to see individuals on the stage and on their ballot that reflect them. And so you're seeing this cycle, and that's really hopeful to me, right? Because you're seeing that realization that if we don't do the work ourselves, we can't expect that others are going to do it for us. And the people that are doing the work right now are not doing it in our self-interest.
Totally. And I would also add that women of color are able to bring them full selves to the table, and they're showing that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can be an elected official and you can breastfeed at the same time. So you have elected officials like Senator Tammy Duckworth bring her child to the office and have a changing room in her office. It sets that narrative that, like, yeah, I can do this. And I think they're also highlighting women of color and are highlighting some of the issues that would potentially get overlooked, right? Like separating moms and their babies at the border, which is huge. And I don't think that if we did not have women in the majorities that we do in the U.S. Congress, we wouldn't be talking about that. And it's refreshing. It's unfortunate it's taken this long, but it's refreshing that we're finally getting caught up to speed and we're talking, more about the kitchen table issues than naming a post office after someone,
Naming a post office. There's a difference to me between leadership and elected folks. And that's what sticks out to me about Stacey Abrams. It's what sticks out to me about some of the candidates we have now, even though I work for the NAACP and I'm nonpartisan. That she ran, one, to show, what's the word? To show commonalities, I guess is the word I could find, between her and the people that she was raised and grew up around, right? That there's a lot of the people who are now, especially in the age of social media, people have to come off as relatable. People have to show that they're real human beings. This politic world is, the walls are being broken down, and we all are starting to find our own ways to be attached to democracy and elected leadership. And I think Stacey's whole entire campaign, and in kind of sort of way, Obama did this a little bit too, for me, because I'm Black. They showed who they were, as opposed, AOC, she did this whole live last night on IG, where she did this Q&A for like 2 hours. And she was like, I'm an elected official, just ask me any questions you want to ask me.
And she keeps doing that.
And she keeps doing it. She's like, hey, y'all, watch me wash clothes. I'm going to show you the life of a real elected official. And I'm like,
I got to do my own laundry.
I got to do my own laundry. There is a level of, what's the word I'm looking for?
Reality.
You see what I'm saying? Yeah, that you want to have with your people. Stacey was able to do that. And so leadership to me is not, I'm the person y'all should elect because I know all the things that y'all need and I'm going to do this on your behalf and I just need you to help me get into office. That's politics, about power, who owns power. But leadership is when Stacey Abrams even gets cheated out of an election, literally. And then one of my favorite speeches that I saw her do was after, what was that, the DNC, after, was it after the DNC? She was like the speaker after, oh man, I think it was like a debate she did. And she was like, look, she did the State of the Union version after one of the debates and was like, here's the reality of, yes, I might have lost, but there is a place for all of us here. And this is not about one person. This is about every single person in not only the party, but in this nation on both sides of the aisle. And we are trying to improve the country. And then she created her organization to now fight back against voter suppression in the state of Georgia. That's leadership. Because she's like, I didn't run just to become governor. I ran because things are still wrong here in the state of Georgia for a majority of the people. And so whether it's me or not me, which it should have been me, she is and we all are clear.
Yes.
It should
on this podcast, we are clear.
We are clear who the real governor is. We're also very clear on who the real president is right now too. But
yes.
So there is a responsibility of leadership that women of color have. To your question, and we're seeing more now of that being the reality of how we want to be governed, right? And how politics should look, and how politics should be shaped, and how we should hold people accountable, and who we want to be our next leader.
And this election cycle, talking about the presidency, you mentioned we've seen a record number of women who are running. And even though a lot of them are not in the race at the moment, different conversation, I just love being on Twitter and just seeing all the photos of particularly young girls, like looking up at them.
Yep.
You know, when Kamala exited the race, she did this great video, and it just talked about, you know, when she ran, she knew it wasn't just about her, that there were like eyes of young girls on her. So, like, in your opinion, how have these women, if they're in the race, not out of the race, like shape the conversation going forward about what women can do? I mean, we know right now at the time of this recording, there's the argument of, can a woman even win the presidency? When I say a woman did win the presidency in 2016, so let's not. But like, what has it meant to you personally?
Let me say this too, and I'm gonna answer your question. For people who are listening to this though, it's all women of color on this panel, and we were having a conversation about how much it means to see women of color in politics and to be leaders, right? I'm thinking about all the angry people who are like, it's not about color, it's not about race, it's not about women of color.
This is not the podcast for you.
One.
Brown girls, guys.
Brown girls. And two, the name of the podcast. One, but two, I need folks to understand that for all of America's history, this has been about white men.
Yes.
And so when we say we enjoy and we feel the love and it's all feel good, mushy stuff, a little black girl's looking up to a black woman who's running for office. And we see pictures of, you know, little girls looking up to people who look like them. It is not just because any other reason except it has never looked like this, and that is not America.
Right.
Period. America is not a bunch of white men ruling a bunch of white men. I don't care what the census says at this point. I don't care what polls say. I think women of color are the majority of people in this country. You can't tell me any different. And so when we don't see ourselves in representation, it's not that it matters because we are requiring diversity. It matters because America needs to the leadership in America needs to represent the people in this country, right? And our representation is not white men. So that's why when that commentator asked the question at the last debate and they said, you know, it's a bunch of white men running, what y'all think? And Biden was like, well, I'm a white man. And Bernie was like, well, I don't want to apologize for being a white man. I'm like, well, wait a minute, hold on. If you do not acknowledge that y'all have played the majority of leadership in this country, and that is not the representation of the collective amount of people in this country, then you are, one, missing the mark, and you shouldn't be the president, and two, you are not acknowledging that there is a necessity to have a government, both on all three branches, a government that represents the people, not fights for, not tells the people what they need to do, but represents and looks like us. And that is so necessary, not just for quotas, but for the future of this country and the democracy and decision-making points around the things that we experience. So to your point, I feel so excited and honored and blessed that we get to live in a time where we're starting to see the reality of that culture shift, where I know, like, even my uncles and my aunts are like nervous and scared still. Even after we got a black president, they're like, well, I don't really think we could get a black woman governor. I don't really think we can get that woman of color. I'm like, we've been able to tear down barriers, and we can continue to do that, right? And we will, obviously. But I need folks who are listening to this who need to get pulled in, because I believe in this work, we got to pull people in. We got to pull folks in that, listen, this is not just about diversity and quotas, it's about representation, and it's about the reality of what the makeup of America looks like, and us showing the rest of the world that our government reflects that.
So Planned Parenthood Action Fund has not endorsed anyone, and Anisha Singh has not endorsed anyone either. But I will just say, for me personally, it was an emotional journey to watch Kamala Harris running for president as an Indian girl, right? Because, for example, towards the end of her campaign, she did this video with Mindy Kaling making dosas, right? Yeah. And I was like, now all y'all know what a dosa is, and that's huge. Now
we all know she's Asian. Like, we didn't know that either. Right. Like, she's a black woman. It's like, no, she got diversity.
Yeah, right? So, like, that whole side of her mother's story and that immigrant story, and her talking about the day-to-day of cooking Indian food and having the food in, like, the containers that me and everyone I know grew up having our food in, and just having WhatsApp blowing up from India and, like, from families across the country. Just like, oh my God, did you see this video? Holy shit, she knows how to make dosa. Like, it's just that whole, like, it matters. It made her real, and it made her like a symbol of hope for the community, which, I'm a Sikh American. I come from advocacy work around post 9/11 discrimination, and I can say post 2016 discrimination looks a lot like post 9/11 discrimination in the sense of how hiked up the statistics are on how many of people in my community and those that look like me are falling victim to hate crimes, bullying, employment discrimination, immigration issues, etc. And to just have all of that always surrounding us and making us feel like, do we belong? Are we at risk of being, whether it's deported or discriminated against? And then to have someone on the screen who is half Indian, who's talking about that experience and saying, look, I am running for president and I'm representing you. And it just brings that hope, and it just brought family, and it brought community members that I haven't heard from in a long time coming out and just feeling that hope with me and with everyone else. And so that's just like a nugget of like how that representation actually ends up playing out in the day-to-day, right? When you're dealing with all of these different emotions and thoughts for yourself, for your fear, for your community, and then something like that happens, and it just brings you that little bit of hope you need to make it to the next fight.
For folks like me who when I see Kamala and Corey, like, right, like we have two black people. Oh my God, where did they come from? I'm just like, this makes us feel more included in the American picture,
right?
Where we didn't before. We were like, oh, we live here and we're American, but we ain't ever get to be president. Like, to see so many folks that look like us and to hear stories like this, I'm like, no, that's what I was talking about. The makeup of this country is us.
And like you were talking about, there's an AAPI candidate, right? Like just
makes
having that,
Makes you
oh,
feel
we're
like
there, we're on that stage.
100%.
And it checks other people, let them know, yeah, we here too. I think that's a part of it.
No, and I think, and just to piggyback off of that, like, when Hillary was robbed of her presidency in 2016, it really made me fear that women were just going to take a back seat and we're going to go back into our corners and we're going to not stand up. But it really has had the opposite effect. Yes. It's really motivated women to keep fighting, to stand up, to run for office. And I'm encouraged by that. Like, I think we have a long way to go, but it really propelled us to be more vocal. Fortunately or unfortunately, like, we should have been there years ago, but like we needed kind of a kick in the pants, and now we're here and we're not going away. And for me, where women are just stereotypically just demure, like not going to speak up, like that's huge. To see that narrative change and to see the momentum even after her loss in 2016.
Yes, I actually called it the Hillary effect. Just seeing so many women want to step up and run because the next day, everyone's kind of like, okay, if not Hillary, then who? And so many women said that it has to be me. I have to be the one to make these changes. I can't rely on other people. And something I heard from a lot of people is they were just shocked to see so many of their local elected officials at a Trump rally. Just not like at a Trump rally, but on stage, co-signing on his stuff. And that made a lot of people think, that's who representing me? Oh, I have to get involved. I have to learn who these people are. And then they realized so many of their elected officials were failing them. And we have seen a lot of women of color step up to run for office. We talked about how women of color fuel the votes. But at the debate, as Tiffany mentioned, it was a very white debate.
It is so frustrating time and time again to see the pandering to communities of color and other communities.
Yes.
And then the day they win, they forget about the promises that they made, the conversations that they've had. And so how are we making sure, as the folks that are helping to advocate and be those voices for our communities, that we are pushing the campaigns now, like Tiffany said, and then making sure that afterwards they're hiring the right staff and they're holding true to their promises, because that cycle is, you can't keep taking us for granted.
Yes.
Period.
And I particularly loved how Senator Booker brought up reproductive freedom so many times. He had articles, and I feel that was important to really kind of start this dialogue with men to be like, you can talk about this too. This isn't, and I love that that was a big part of his platform to say, like, dudes, get it together. This isn't just about the ladies.
He said this recently. He said, you don't need to have the same reproductive organs. You just need to be a human, right?
So we talked about the fact that when we did have the candidates of color in the race, they talked about issues that were very important to people of color. One of those definitely being the field of justice. So be it reproductive freedom, environmental justice, justice at the ballot box. These are things that are going to be very important to us. And even though we will have the presidential candidates talking about it, we know that this is really going to play a bigger role at the local level. So just for our listeners who are also voters, what are some of the things in your respective field regarding justice that they should be paying attention to now, not when they get their sample ballot and they see something? What should be at the forefront when it comes to the justice issues that will be on the ballot in November?
I'll start. I think that there's a misnomer that voters out there, especially your listeners, may not know that the communities of color and low-income communities are the most impacted by climate change, fueled by extreme weather, that are most likely to live near pollution just by default. These communities where these folks live, they are literally the dumping grounds for toxic pollution and more threatened by extreme weather, flooding, heat, and fires. And quite frankly, the League of Conservation Voters is just catching up with these environmental justice groups that are organized, that have been in these communities organizing forever. So, something that to keep an eye out is to see what presidential candidates are actually visiting these communities of color where they are impacted every day by environmental change. It's huge.
We saw that a lot with Castro.
Yep.
He did that a lot.
So one of the reasons I came to Planned Parenthood Action Fund is to make sure that every day people are recognizing the link between what is happening to our reproductive health care and what is happening to our democracy and what is happening to our courts. Because when you can understand how all of these different pieces come together, you can understand what is wrong with our system and how we need to, what we were saying, unrig that system. And so one thing I noticed in 2016 that kind of stuck with me and kind of drives me every single day to go to work is I remember seeing on the TVs time and time again people being interviewed about who they're going to vote for and hearing close to the election, well, I'm not crazy about Trump, but I don't want to see us lose the courts, so I want a conservative court, and so I'm going to vote for the Republican candidate. You did not hear that on the progressive side. You did not hear, I'm not crazy about her, but I'm still going to vote for her because there's this empty Supreme Court seat, and there are over 100 vacancies across our lower courts that are going to be filled with lifetime appointments, and I'm really scared of what that could mean. There is not that connection. There was not that connection. I think the post-election kind of Kavanaugh fight and the Gorsuch fight, a lot of that started showing the progressive movement and progressive voters a little bit of that color, and we're seeing it now. But really just tying those knots are super important for voters to really realize what has happened. And just to recap, Trump has now appointed over 187 judges to lifetime seats, which is 20% of our judiciary and a fourth of our circuit court for a lifetime. They're mostly young people who will sit there for 40, 50 years, way past his time, fulfilling his agenda. The politicians, the elected officials, nominating or helping the president appoint these conservative anti-abortion judges who then go ahead and rule in cases about things like gerrymandering, about things like abortion, et cetera, in favor of those same politicians. And then you have this cycle where those laws are in place. You have gerrymandering and others that make sure that those politicians win again, and you have this cycle. All that to say, making sure that you're thinking about that broad picture of democracy reform, of saving our judiciary in order to save the issues that you care about. So whether it is the environment or civil rights or reproductive health care, whatever the issue, it comes down to what's happening to our courts, what's happening to our democracy, what's happening to the systems in place, and how we can make sure that we have elected officials in place that shape it in a way we want to see it.
That is so important because what you said, like all of this is very strategic. First, we're going to get the state houses, and then we'll get, the presidency, and then like we'll do the courts. This was just all very coordinated and planned. Yes.
Very intentional.
And this is when people say like, oh, politics, blah. I'm like, there are people out there plotting, to make this country shape their views.
Using the judiciary as a political tool, as opposed to where we think it's like the lawyers, like rule of law, like holy grail situation. No, like it's being used as a political tool by one side. How are we making sure we're protecting it the way we want to see it and how we want it to be shaped, and restore that legitimacy to it?
So speaking of getting the work done, Tiffany, you're just killing it at the NAACP with young people. I love seeing everything that you're doing. And there's already the conversation, will young voters turn out? Do they care? What matters to them? What are you seeing with all of these phenomenally engaged young people that you work with every day?
Thank you for affirming those folks. Yeah, because it's always the question of, I knew you were going to do that, but because that's who you are. A lot of folks are asking, where are the young people at? They've been asking that for years. And I'm like, they ain't gone nowhere. Why y'all asking where they at? Like, you might not see them because you don't have an Instagram page. You might not see them because you don't ask them what it is that they want to do, because your meetings don't allow young people to come to those conversations or to be fully engaged and present with agency at that table. Ooh. But don't be mistaken. Young people are everywhere already. And then they shut up, after they see all the stats of young people turned out in Texas, young people turned out in this New Hampshire. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Young folks that I work with, again, and a majority of our population for the NAACP is in the South, in my chapters. And so what I'm seeing, and this actually happened today, I was on a call with one of my student leaders, Ryan Peddleton, who is in Alabama, and he's like, yeah, we got a census event next Tuesday. We're registering people already because we're not waiting for voter registration day in September. We got 2 registration events that happen in this. And I'm like, yep, I know you are. I know you're already engaged. I know you're not waiting until the end of the year. I know we're planning in advance. I got students at tomorrow, actually, President Derek Johnson of the NAACP is the convocation speaker at FAMU, Florida Agricultural Mechanical University. Ooh. And so we're bringing Florida State University students across the street to come to, to bring, once you start naming schools, everybody's like, okay, so, and so Florida State students are coming to meet with President Johnson to talk about and get consultation on, here is our statewide plan in Tallahassee, especially of all places in Florida, in Tallahassee, to start knocking on doors early, to start registering people early, to have these conversations early. Listen, my people care about student debt. They care about affordability, accessibility, safety, and retention in education, not just in college, but in high schools and middle schools too. My people care about jobs and wages. My people care about healthcare like everybody else. My folks care about democracy and protecting voting rights and increasing the Voting Rights Act. My folks care about criminal justice reform and ending mass incarceration, as you will, ending the death penalty, as you will find out in Just Mercy in the movie. My folks care about all of these things. And so the young people that you're going to see rise to the occasion, you should just know two myth busters. One, they're not new to this work. They've been doing this work, who are under-resourced, who are also full-time students, who are also sometimes full-time parents, who have 4 other jobs because they can't afford to do the work that they're already doing, who also have 8 other things that they have to care about and are also just living their life as a young person, as most of us do as we're growing up. That's the first myth. And the second myth is that they don't care and they're not engaged or they're apathetic. And that's not the case. A lot of times I work with people who still don't have computers or internet. I work with people who have to go to a library, who have to go to their computer lab at their school just to get the work done, right? I work with people who live in rural communities who, most of the students who go to Tougaloo or who go to Jackson State or who go to these schools, their students are from out of state. So they're doing absentee ballots. So I got students with this at Howard University, for example, who are making sure now that we find a way to hold people accountable to make sure that they're receiving their ballots on time from out of state and are able to return them to get counted, right? We're doing that work January 12th, not waiting until the fall when school starts to get people riled up when it's back to school time. So I think I look at organizations like the NAACP Youth College Division. I look at organizations like the Alliance for Youth Action. I look at Black Youth Project. I look at United We Dream. I look at Dream Defenders, who are already pushing out videos about the census, about elections. We started early. And if you're not paying attention, it's because you're deciding that you don't want to follow and be engaged with those communities who are doing that work. But I encourage you to ask us. Planned Parenthood, I'm working with folks who run the HBCU program there. We're already doing coalition work in some of our HBCUs. We have an HBCU tour in the fall we're doing. We're already doing the work. And it's not new because of a presidential election. It's not new because of Donald Trump. It's not new because women of color are running for office. We're already, we've already been here. We've already been doing this work. So the folks that you allowed us to give shout outs to earlier, I like that process. We have to uplift those hidden figures.
I love doing that. That's what the podcast is about. It's uplifting all of you, then uplifting the great women that you work with, because there are people doing this work. I mean, it's not like Harry Potter where there's like little magical people working behind the scenes and things appear. Like, this is work.
Right, and there's a lot of them. It's not just the people that you see on social media who got 1 billion followers.
Emily, what are some of the amazing things that LCV has coming up, and how can our listeners who really care about climate change or global warming and environmental issues get involved?
Yeah, no, totally. So we are currently running a program to just elevate the topic of climate change in the presidential debate. We are not like Planned Parenthood taking a position or endorsing any one candidate. We are excited to have every presidential candidate has a climate plan starting on day one. Trump has rolled back close to 100 different environmental regulations since he's been in office, which is taking us backwards on clean air, clean water, and putting all our health at risk. So that's the first main thing. I think the second main thing is we're going to run probably one of the biggest independent expenditure programs this cycle to not only elect a pro-climate president, but to flip the U.S. Senate to pro-climate, to protecting the House of Representatives, which is pro-climate right now. And this cycle is probably the last cycle that we have to be able to stop the bleeding on climate change. And so for folks that want to get involved, like, we have community organizers, we have town halls, we have folks, we're always looking for folks to volunteer. So, go to lcv.org or tweet at us at LC Voters to get involved. We're always looking for that ground, that field work.
Awesome. Anisha, you have given us so much this episode. You dropped so much knowledge. But the fact is, us women, we're under attack. I don't know any other way to say it than that. We are absolutely on the menu. So what are some of the things that Planned Parenthood is doing? And again, I have to just shout out how intersectional you all are in the work that you do. So what are some of the things that we need to watch out for? And for our listeners who want to get engaged in these efforts, what can they do?
And so now we're going bigger this year, and we have a historic initial investment of $45 million in battleground states across the country because we recognize the urgency, right? It is so vital that we win this election cycle, and we recognize that if we don't, there's just going to be so much more that is going to be dismantled, and Roe is already at stake, and this is already an emergency situation. And what I was talking about before, we're not going to be able to protect the courts and our democracy and all of the pieces that intersect with reproductive health care and reproductive freedom if we don't win. And we recognize that, and so that's why we have this historic investment. I think things that folks can do, no matter what community you're coming from, just pay attention to what your litigators are doing across the board, local, state, federal. If you're not happy with the way that they have been performing in their job, it's time for them to lose their job, right? And so call them out, let them know that, and be engaged on all levels. And again, if you're not happy with the way they're performing, get involved. Join Planned Parenthood Action Fund, join partner organizations that are doing the great work to make sure that we are registering folks to vote, that we are knocking on doors and doing everything we can to turn this train around. And the last thing I'll say is talk about the courts and talk about democracy reform.
Yes. All right, moving into our final question. Any final thoughts on 2020 or advice for the brown girls out there listening who are like, I want to be like her, I want to get involved in politics. This is definitely an exciting time to do it. So just anything you want to close with.
I'll say this, and this is, just my personal, we've all had a really hard time dealing with the political environment of the last few years, and it's exhausting. It can burn you out, and especially if you're not on the front lines and in the trenches, watching it can be even worse, right? Because you feel like helpless, and you're trying to figure out what exactly you can do. And I think that goes back to everything we've talked about here, which is why we're seeing more and more women getting involved, recognizing that the best form of self-care can sometimes be just getting involved, right? And one thing that gives me hope and the one thing that centers me is the reminder that out of darkness always comes light. And so, yes, this has been a terrible 3 years, and we're seeing a lot. We're unearthing a lot of ugly in all of this. But what it's also doing is it's galvanizing and it's inspiring young women of color to run for office, to get engaged, to have tough conversations with their neighbors and their communities, and to recognize what our values are, where we stand, to reaffirm the policies that we want to see in this country and the kind of country that we want to see. It's giving all of us an opportunity to really think about how we want to prioritize in this country and what we want America to stand for all of us. And so taking that and recognizing that we are all right now, every single one of us, in a position to do that and to reshape and to reshape the conversation and this country the way we want to see it, and to not be afraid to get involved, right? I think because things are in such an emergency state, we have to look past our fear of getting involved and recognize that we are all overqualified at this point to get involved and have that voice, and that only when we all show up for each other, whether it's cross-movement, organizationally, or on the ground reaching out to our neighbors, it's only when we all work together that we fight and we win. And I think that kind of message and realization as like a North Star helps me and maybe helps others.
I would say just do it. I mean, I think, we are always looking to build that bench of the next great Simone Sanders, the next great Donna Brazils, and the next great, Connie Chung. It's like we are looking for that, and they shouldn't be deterred about how hard it is to get into this business, because it's not hard. You have to find something that you're going to be passionate about and just fight, do it, whether it's women's rights, voting access, or climate change. Being able to just, lean in and take that risk is huge. And you shouldn't be deterred about any obstacles that you may find, because there is a support system out there that's going to help you through the process.
That's key too, yeah.
I just did a speech not too long ago for some students in California, and at the end of it I told them two things. One is, when we think about, let me say this first. this is a long marathon,
Yeah.
not just like a race, right? So we're always talking about how every year is super important and everything is always urgent. But we need to your point, we need to make sure that we're pacing ourselves and not compromising our mental and spiritual health with what America's got going on, because there's a lot going on in America. We have to pace ourselves and recognize that this is a long run, not just a short race. What happens after 2020 is census and gerrymandering, and we have to also remember that like there's other midterm elections that are happening next year, and that we have to remember past that governors are signing on to having a constitutional convention. We need to be aware that this is a long game and not just who's going to win in November. And then the second thing I told them was, when I talk about politics, folks often start from a standpoint of deficit, and what freedom looks like is what we don't have. And I'm challenging folks to think about freedom in terms of what we want it to look like and in an abundance, and what is our agenda. And so I'm not saying, well, we need to solve mass incarceration because mass incarceration is a problem. I'm saying, what does it look like to have a world with no prisons? What does it look like to have a world where free Wi-Fi is everywhere? What does it look like to have a world where education is free? Not just let's solve student debt, but like, what about free education? And if we don't have an abundance agenda, if we don't think about freedom as a proactive, right, frame of reference, then we're going to continue to burn ourselves out with what we know we need to fight against.
Yep.
And not what we need to fight for.
Yeah.
And so my students were like, I was like, what is freedom to you guys? And they were like, oh, you know, white supremacy, we get rid of white supremacy. And I was like, okay, what is freedom to you guys? And like, oh, no student debt. What is white supremacy? What is freedom? And they're like, oh, we want access to choose what we're going to do with our own bodies. And I'm like, yeah, those are all the things that we're fighting against that we don't have. What are the things that we want? And that agenda, people, women of color, I think have always been at the forefront of determining what that agenda is, not just for our own communities, but for this entire planet. So let's not lose sight of what that is. So it's a marathon, you know, not a race. And digest, think about, sit with, and remind yourselves to stay grounded in this work. What is freedom to you?
I love that.
Oh, that's perfect. Anisha, Tiffany, Emily, thank you for joining us and getting our listeners ready for 2020. I appreciate you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
And thanks to our live studio audience.
Thank you to Emily, Tiffany, and Anisha for setting the stage for 2020. Make sure you stay tuned to the BGG on our website, www.thebgguide.com, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The BG Guide to find out more on the role women of color are playing in 2020. I hope you've enjoyed this season, Brown Girls. I want to thank all of our Brown Girl and non-Brown Girl listeners for continuing with us on this journey. We started this season with the BGG listeners telling us what they love most about the podcast, and we wanted to end the season with some of your favorite moments.
I believe that we all have a moral responsibility to pay it forward. What would Fannie Lou Hamer do? What would Shirley Chisholm do? What would Dr. King do? What would anyone in my position do?
Our pastor at the time used to say, I can't tell you who to vote for, but I can tell you that this is the person who showed up.
Issues of racism cannot simply be issues for Black and brown women.
Government works well when it reflects the population it seeks to represent.
There's this misconception that to be a donor, you have to give large sums of money, when in fact, most of the donations that drive a lot of these progressive candidates and national organizations are these grassroots small dollar donations.
I do remember when I started getting to the point where my pros and cons, when I looked at the cons, not reasons not to run, they all fear-based reasons as opposed to the pro side, which were all faith-based reasons.
I hate this phrase that says, if you don't vote, you don't count. I mean, I think that's ridiculous to say. I think a human being, the very nature that you are a human being, that in fact you have value and you count. It is not the vote that brings you the value.
Thank you, Wonder Media Network, for producing another wonderful season of this podcast. Until next time, Brown Girls.